Have you ever wanted to have a conversation about or around disability with someone with a disability and just felt uncomfortable, uncertain? You've tried to have the conversation, you just didn't quite understand what they were saying? Well, this is a video for you. Welcome to my series, Disability 101, where we talk about things that people are just maybe a little bit uncomfortable talking about when it comes to disability in order to have better conversations about, around, and with people with disabilities. Hi, if you're new here, my name is Isa, and I'm a disabled writer and advocate who is starting their PhD this fall in communication studies with a focus in disability culture and identity. I'm very excited to share this subject with you, and I hope that you share it with your friends too, who might also have some questions. In this video, I'm going to talk about more of a general perspective to disability, but there might be some people who disagree with the things that I say, and their opinions and perspectives in their community is just as valid as what I say here. The goal of this video is to be a starting point to have conversations and kind of at least understand what these words mean when a person with a disability uses them. According to the CDC, in 2023, about 27% of the US population has some type of disability. This number has only increased since COVID as a mass disabling event, as well as medical technology making it possible for people like myself who would not have survived without medical advancements to survive. And it doesn't erase disability, but rather makes it possible for people to live with complex medical conditions. So what is a disability? Well, a person with a disability is a person who lives with a physical or mental, and sometimes both, impairment that limits one or more major life activities, like walking, standing, eating, socializing. The list goes on and on. The big thing to realize is that the disability community is diverse and complex, and it is a community, which means that language evolves over time, people's preferences evolve over time, because it is a living, breathing thing that is constantly being formed and reformed. So starting off, you need to know two main things: the social model of disability and the medical model of disability. So the medical model is the old model of disability. It is the one that they used in ye old times, which basically kind of looks at disability as a problem within someone's body that needs to be fixed and cured. The second model is the social model, which was created and adapted by disability advocates specifically in like the 1970s to 1990s during the big fight to get to the Americans with Disability Act, which was passed in 1991. The social model explains that disability exists when there is inaccessibility. So a person is disabled by their environment. A child who needs glasses is disabled until they receive glasses. A person in a wheelchair is disabled when they try to go into a building that doesn't have a ramp or doesn't have the things that they need to be able to access those spaces, that they could do their job, they could be a member of society. It is these physical limitations that are created that creates the disabling effect. The social model has been critiqued in the recent years for its rigid perspective to disability, but it's still primarily used within advocacy spaces. The big thing to know is that disability will exist regardless of accessibility, but the disabling aspect, how disabling your disability is in a given environment, is largely related to how accessible that environment is. This leads us to disability identity. So disability identity is a concept that a person identifies as disabled, and it's kind of related to disability pride. So why should I identify as disabled? Well, I am a wheelchair user with chronic illnesses and chronic pain. I have a life-threatening condition. What is about that to be proud of? Well, what I find pride in is my ability to exist and take up space, even though there's a lot of things in the world that tries to make disabled people ashamed of themselves. Also, I am proud of the community that I come from, that I would not be able to go back for my PhD had it not been for the disability advocates who fought so hard to get the ADA passed. I think it's personally just fascinating that I was born in 1998, the ADA was passed in 1991, and I have seen over the course of my life how the ADA has taken effect and changed in these buildings, because there's still old buildings today that are not ADA accessible, but not nearly as much as they were when I was really young. Back to language. When we talk about disability identity, we also need to kind of put note on person first language and identity first language. Person first language was developed alongside the social model of disability, which tries to humanize a person with a disability by putting their personhood before their disability. A person with Down syndrome, a person with a disability, rather than a disabled person. And this nuance in language shifts kind of depending on how a person identifies. I identify as a disabled person because I find my disability as an intrinsic part of me, as much as my gender, as much as other factors in my life, other identity markers of mine, and it's not something that I am ashamed of. That's not necessarily to say people who prefer person first language are ashamed of their disability. It's just choosing to use disabled first and identity first is a specific choice to counter those who would make people with disabilities ashamed. Here, there's even more nuance where some communities prefer person first language and some communities prefer identity first language in all circumstances. And this depends a lot on stigma. The big thing to note is that generally, any person with a disability finds person first language as a respectful, neutral phrasing. The only thing that shifts in that is if someone has said, I identify as a disabled person, and you go, no, you're not disabled, you're a person with a disability. And I have had that conversation, and it is very frustrating, and that's where disrespect starts happening. So just kind of see it as, if you don't know if a person identifies as disabled or not, if you're talking about people with disabilities, so people with conditions that are limiting, then you would talk about a person with a disability. But to me, especially, I like to use disabled for myself. I use the disabled community when referring to those who also identify as disabled. Just follow the language that someone asks you to use. On the other end, the big thing to know is that disability is not a bad word. Being disabled is not a bad thing. That when using identity first language, when adopting disability pride and adopting disability identity, we are neutralizing shame. We are saying, this is nothing to be ashamed of. It is a natural part of life. It is part of who I am, and it exists, and it is neither necessarily good or bad. But the people who are also disabled are really fantastic and beautiful and amazing, and I love being part of their community. To finish this off, I want to talk about the different types of disabilities. And this is not medical categories. These are categories that people use in order to talk about their specific experience. And I'm talking about invisible versus visible versus dynamic disabilities. A person with an invisible disability is someone who may be assumed to be non-disabled when you first meet them. And this is not, like I said, it's not a specific medical category. I can be invisibly disabled as an ambulatory wheelchair user, which means that I can walk and I am also a wheelchair user. So when I meet someone, if I am walking or if I am on Zoom or if I'm on YouTube, if I don't tell you that I'm disabled, most people are going to assume that I'm not disabled. Now, with that said, is that not everyone with an invisible disability is invisible to everyone. I can tell when someone has diabetes if I can see their CGM or their pump, because I also have known and loved people with CGMs and insulin pumps. So I recognize that, or feeding tubes. Those things do not make someone visible. It's part of the reason why invisible disabilities is such a ever kind of shifting perspective, but it mostly is used as a way to describe certain stigmas that someone experiences. So someone with an invisible disability might talk about how they feel like they have to prove that they're disabled enough, or that they're told that they're faking their disability, or that they got a note on their car that says, stop using placards because you're obviously stealing it, you're obviously not sick, you're obviously not disabled. That's really what the term invisible disability is used to talk about, is that unique experience where you feel like you have to justify your disability a lot. On the other side, we have visible disabilities. So visible disabilities are ones where a person is assumed to be disabled when you first meet them. And this doesn't necessarily mean that you know what their disability is. I'm an ambulatory wheelchair user, which means that when I meet most people, I am in my wheelchair when I meet them. So they see me as disabled. Again, there's more nuance to that, because if you're in a scooter or if you are very, very young, sometimes people don't think that you're disabled just because you're in a wheelchair or using a scooter or using a mobility aid, because they think you're faking or something else. But for people who are perceived consistently as disabled, some of the things that they struggle with include being talked down to, assuming their intelligence, assuming that they don't understand or that they can't do something. And there's just a lot of those experiences that someone has when they are being perceived as disabled upon first meeting someone. Now we have our third term, which is dynamic disability, which means that a person who has a disability where their symptoms changes day to day. Someone with a dynamic disability can be visibly disabled. They can also be invisibly disabled. But a lot of times when used in context of invisible versus visible disabilities, it's talking about someone who might use crutches some days, might use a wheelchair other days, might not use anything another day, and that their symptoms changes day to day based off of whatever they're experiencing at that specific time. I really just want to note that my disability can be invisible, it can be visible, it can be dynamic. All of these things are true, and it doesn't make any of them false. And when we talk about disability, and especially when we talk about identity in general, that we as a society in the United States especially want people to be like, this is what I am, and this is what I am 100% of the time. And they don't want people to change. We want to just kind of know what to expect from people. But disability is not rigid. It is very fluid. It changes based off of where you are, what's going on, who is perceiving you, all of these things. And so when we're talking about disability, when we're using these terms, when we're listening to people talk about these things, these are not the rigid factors that we should interpret them, but rather language that they're using to describe a very specific experience in that moment. And the more that we approach these conversations like that, the better conversations that we can have in the long run. Thank you so much for watching this episode of Disability 101, Disability Terminology. There are definitely terms that we didn't get to talk about, some things that are more harmful, and I'll probably do a whole video about that. But I just wanted to do this video as a starting point. Please share with your friends and family who you think might benefit from this video, and have a conversation. If you disagree with something that I have said, please leave a comment down below. If you have a question, I will approach everything in good faith as long as your comments are made in good faith. And I just really want to help foster these conversations. I've had several conversations with people in my life recently where someone said, oh, I don't think I've ever had a conversation with a person with a disability before, but people with disabilities, that's 20%, 27% of the US population, which means that this person probably has had multiple, and I know has had multiple conversations with people with disabilities before. They just never had a conversation about disability with someone who they knew had a disability. And I think the more people we feel comfortable talking about disability, the better our environments are going to be. So thank you so much for listening, and I will see you guys next week.